There are two tanks from World War II whose nature and use are constantly discussed by anyone who has ever heard of them. We are talking about the Sherman and the Tiger. In this video, we'll talk about the first one, the M4 Sherman, which I consider the most interesting and receives a lot of negative attention, much of it undeserved. First of all, there's one thing we always need to remember. Saying Sherman doesn't really say anything. The M4 Sherman underwent many different evolutions and improvements during the war. From 42, when it was introduced into service, to 57, when it was officially retired. Let's just discuss the M4 Sherman for simplicity. From the perspective of the Second World War, even though it saw a lot of combat in other wars and theaters, first of all Korea, in the 1950s, let's recap the history of the design and its evolution thanks to my friend Peter Ironborn. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks to Vlad for letting me play a small part in his video. As for the development of the M4, we're not talking about just a simple tank. The legendary American medium tank, developed in 1942, launched the universal tank concept. In short, a tank that can do everything, everywhere, in the best way and without excessive complication. The United States relied on the requests of the High Command to develop the Army's vehicles. Explaining how military vehicle development works in the United States would take at least an hour-long video. Let's break it down to basics. You could say that the general problem was to determine what kind of equipment would be most needed and at the same time possible to produce in hundreds, thousands, or millions of units in time to contribute to the war. Let me focus on that last sentence. You have a war to fight, you can't just sit around waiting for the perfect piece of equipment. Furthermore, the two biggest problems the United States has always faced were mainly the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which means that anything you build will have to fight thousands of kilometers away from the nearest factory. So the vehicle must reach the front and remain operational. So it will need to have as few potential failures as possible to reduce the need for spare parts. You'll also need low requirements for consumables like fuel, lubricant, and ammunition. I'd like to add that the Germans or the Russians could bring all their vehicles back to a factory to have them modified if necessary. The Americans couldn't do that. They had to use whatever they sent to the front. It would have had to stay there until it was destroyed, until the end of the war, or in case it was declared lost. In short, what's the point of having the best equipment in the world if it can't contribute to the conflict? With that said, let's start talking about practical things. Before the war, American tanks were outdated because infantry controlled them completely. After the invasion of France by Nazi Germany, the United States realized that a 37mm cannon could never be used as an efficient anti-tank gun. That's why they developed the 75mm cannon. In 1941, after the United States joined the war, Allies and Russia requested some equipment to boost their forces. They specifically asked for aircraft, tanks, and weapons. Because the M4 was still being designed, they sent the existing M3 General Lee tank with an unfairly bad reputation. This was meant as a temporary fix since the first M4 General Sherman models began rolling off assembly lines within a year. The vehicle combined proven old and new technologies. Engine, transmission, cannon, stabilizers, suspension, and more had already been proven effective on the M3. Furthermore, following what was said earlier, the priorities for building the vehicle were reliability, safety, usability, and crew comfort. Right after the vehicle was deployed, the first British reports started coming in, which were full of praise for the M4 but didn't hold back a fair amount of criticism either. First of all, the sight. The Sherman was originally equipped with a periscopic sight mounted on the gunner's periscope, but it didn't have any magnification. That's why telescopic coaxial sights with 3 times magnification were installed. Another criticism was the right turret's protection. Ammunition and the frontal protrusion of the driver and assistant driver were first addressed by adding extra armor. After the 30th tank, spring-loaded hatches were added to make exiting easier in case of fire. Starting in 1943, a second round of improvements mainly involved changes to the hull. The angle was reduced from 57 to 46 degrees with an increase in armor from 2 to 3 inches to compensate. You can also see a hatch for the loader. And finally, the beginning of the Sherman series with the 76.2mm M1 anti-tank gun and the T-23 turret with wet storage ammunition. The third set of modifications focused on its already excellent mobility and reliability. Horizontal volute spring suspensions and wider tracks were introduced, along with updated transmissions and engines using the most modern, reliable components of the time. Third, the third set of improvements involved the suspension and as a result, wider tracks. The British 17-pounder gun was rejected because it made the tank extremely cramped and because it was a poor gun for explosive shells. The United States developed an infrared system before the Germans, but it worked differently for both. Multi-fuel engine for the M4A6 version was rejected because it wasn't as versatile as hoped. I could go on forever listing doctrines, ideas, and projects for the Sherman. For example, the M46 will have a 12-cylinder diesel engine and a 2-plane gun stabilizer. But this is Vlad's video, so I want to thank Vlad once again for giving me a little space in his video.
Thank you very much, Peter. Peter was essential in coming up with the idea for this video. He helped me a lot with the research and with correcting the script. After this introduction, let's get to the point. Myth number 1. The Sherman was a death trap. Perhaps the biggest criticism of the Sherman is that it catches fire, and this is repeated everywhere. Recently on Netflix, I watched a documentary called Greatest Events of World War II in Color. Despite the beautiful color footage, one of these is the continuation of the myth that the Sherman catches fire. Like every myth or legend, it has a tiny bit of truth behind it. The Sherman, it uses gasoline, and gasoline catches fire more easily than diesel. Okay, it's true that the ammunition can explode or catch fire if hit, okay, but any tank that carries ammunition and gasoline can catch fire. And him joined them, the Americans and others who, along with the Germans, were the only ones to use gasoline-powered tanks. The negative reputation of the Sherman is due to a mistaken perception, the so-called survivor bias. Here's an example to explain. During World War I, the British introduced helmets. And strangely, the number of head injuries increased. How is that possible? The British thought, we gave them helmets, they should use them for protection. Instead, the number of wounded increased. Very simple, because the number of deaths decreased. This myth about the Sherman comes from a man who wrote a book that was as famous as it was full of inaccuracies and complete falsehoods. Death Traps by Belton Cooper is a memoir by an officer who worked with mechanics on the Western Front. He only sees destroyed Shermans. He never sees working Shermans. He never sees destroyed German panzers. And so he tells us about all these destroyed Shermans that caught fire. And his conclusion must be that it's a death trap. But instead, something similar happened as with the helmet. Many Sherman crews would talk about how the Sherman caught fire while they were escaping, forgetting one fundamental detail: they were alive to tell the tale, because the Sherman had a low survival rate. It happened occasionally, but no more often than with German tanks, that something inside would catch fire. And that was the biggest problem, because 98% of the Shermans that caught fire did so because of the ammunition. It was solved with, for example, the introduction of the so-called wet stowage, which drastically reduced the problem of ammunition exploding or catching fire. I'll give you some numbers to help you understand just how safe the Sherman actually was. An American tank had an 80% chance of survival. If his tank was destroyed, half of those who didn't make it were killed outside the tank by enemy action. In total, 3% of American tanks fell victim to the war. The rate for the infantry was 18%. If you had to be on the front line, maybe the Sherman was the safest place to be. Myth number 2. The Sherman wasn't sufficiently armored. We immediately addressed the first myth about the survival of the vehicle and crew. I've already shown you that the Sherman was actually very safe. It's considered a medium tank, just a bit tougher than a tin can. Well, let's remember that it entered service in 1942, a few months before the more famous Tiger. At the front, it has 51 m of armor sloped at 56 degrees, but what does that mean? With a bit of trigonometry, we find that the effective thickness is 92 mm, just a little less than the Tiger's 100. If we also add the fact that the quality of American steel was much higher than the German one, the Germans lacked many rare metals to make their armor particularly effective. The Tiger is definitely not considered an armored tank, but the Sherman, which is equivalent, is... Yes, that's absurd, obviously. From the side, the Sherman was better armored than the Panzer IV or even the Panther. It wasn't bad, that's it. This was also reflected in the crew's survival. Myth number 3. The Sherman was not sufficiently armed. As for the armament, the myth that it was insufficient is to blame. I give it to the gamers, since in games only one thing matters, a little number called penetration. Gamers familiar with military history know the Sherman's medium velocity cannon has low penetration, so it's ineffective. Obviously not. Reality is much more complex. Most of the time, tanks don't face other tanks. This is pretty obvious if we look at the proportions of the ammunition they carried. For the standard Sherman, it was 70% explosive, 20% armor-piercing, and 10% smoke rounds. It's a medium velocity cannon, ideal for firing explosive and smoke rounds. Consider that many American tankers, after receiving the Sherman armed with the 76mm anti-tank gun, complained. And they wanted the 75 back because the 76 had insufficient explosive ammunition, and most of the time they used that. The 75 was, for the vast majority of its use, perfectly adequate. It handled the Panzer IV just fine, which was the tank they encountered most often, since it was the one produced the most by the Germans. On the rare occasions when American tanks had to face something bigger, there were plenty of ways to destroy it. Tank destroyers, artillery, aviation, other Shermans, infantry. They managed somehow, and that's exactly what they did. Don't get me wrong. There was a need for something bigger that could destroy heavy vehicles or future heavy vehicles. Ultimately, nearly all new Shermans were fitted with the 76mm anti-tank gun. Now, as Peter mentioned to me, the British did it with the 17-pounder, but at the cost of terrible ergonomics, which was unacceptable for the Americans. A study from that time showed that the winner of a tank battle, regardless of the type of vehicle, is 4 times out of 5 the one who fires the first shot. And the Sherman excelled at this for 2 reasons. The first reason is the excellent quality and placement of the optics. Second, though to a lesser degree, is stabilizing the cannon. The crew had excellent visibility that no other tank in the war had. Both the commander and the gunner had periscopes from which they could look out in all directions, 360 degrees. For the gunner, the periscope also served as the sight, providing a major advantage in target acquisition of targets and a huge tactical advantage. And Sherman could stay behind a hill, only sticking out its periscopes to observe the target. When it was ready to fire, it would come out from behind the hill. The cannon was already aimed, since the gunner could see what the tank commander saw through the periscope. It was aimed quickly because it was stabilized. It could fire a shot and go back. Something that no other tank in the war could do. All the others that were armed had coaxial sights. So, even if only the commander's periscope was sticking out, the gunner couldn't see anything. The cannon was stabilized, so if the commander spotted something, the tank had to move forward. At that moment, the gunner could see something. He had to find the target, aim at the target, and fire the shot. It took much longer than a Sherman, and 4 out of 5 times, whoever fired first won. The Sherman excelled at this. Fun fact. By the way, when the Germans captured and used the Shermans, they loved them. The Russians received Shermans from the Americans, and they were in love with them. I hope that with this video, I've shown you some myths and truths about the M4 Sherman, which was probably the best tank, because of the war for all the facts I just listed. Thanks again to Peter, who helped me a lot in writing this video and in the research needed to make it. What can I say? I, as always, am Vlad Sparastoria and I know things. And I'll see you next time.